Now that our color system is in place, and now that the theoretical foundations have been established, it's time to ask ourselves how to recognize and identify a color from a model. First of all, it should be remembered that a color is not created out of nothing. Every color needs a context. Thus, the painter does not find a color. He always proceeds by comparison and adjustments. To check a color from a model, the first trick is to hold a palette knife between your eye and the model. Close one eye and compare the paint to your target color on the model. Make sure that the temperature of the light is the same on your subject and on your canvas. It's a very simple technique, but it works really well to pick a specific color. Another method is more effective to work on the whole. This technique is called keying. Keying consists in choosing a reference color called a key color on the model and on the palette, and admitting that they are the same. The easiest is to key with the darkest color. This way, the darkest color on your model and the darkest color on your palette are considered equal. For example, on this demonstration, I decide that this color on the model and this color on my palette are equal. Once this key color has been found, all the remaining colors in the painting are found by comparison from one to the other. Rather than trying to find each isolated color, make sure that the difference between the key color and the neighboring color is the same on the model and on the subject. From there, proceed by comparing the colors one by one every time. Be careful, you are actually trying to make the same difference. You're not trying to make the same colors. You have to focus on the relationship between colors. Keying can also be useful to make a painting lighter or darker at will. For example, you can decide that the black on your model will be represented on your painting by a fairly light gray. Thus, all of the colors which are found by comparison with this light gray will also follow the same shift, and the whole painting will appear lighter. This technique also solves the very particular problem that arises for those who want to have their model on a computer screen or a tablet or a smartphone screen. If you try to match a screen color by holding a palette knife in front of the screen, you'll almost never get the right color because the paint on your palette knife is subject to the shadows and light variations in your studio, whereas the screen emits its own color, and the visual impression of the subject on your canvas will never be the same as the visual impression of the image emitted by the screen. It can become a real headache to paint with a screen as a model. First of all, you have to try to avoid working from a screen as much as possible, or at least use additional means to look at the model. If possible, print the model using the right settings. But if you want to use the screen as the model, you will find that keying is a very essential technique that you'll need to master. When two paints are mixed in different proportions, we get what can be called a mixing line or mixing path. This line is composed of all the nuances that can be obtained from 100% of the first color to 100% of the second. Theoretically, it should be possible to represent the mixing lines by straight lines in the color wheel. But as we've already seen, the reality of pigment mixtures is extremely complex. Thus, in practice, pigment mixing lines are rarely straight lines. Depending on the pigment, they can curve very strongly. Mixing reduces chroma. Keep this very important principle in mind. No subtractive mixture can result in a color with a higher chroma than one of the starting colors of the palette. It's important to understand that any paint mixture causes a drop in chroma. This phenomenon is represented in the color mixing wheel. when two pigments are connected, the mixing line cuts the wheel towards the center, therefore towards the shades with the lowest chroma. The further apart two paints are from each other, the more their mixture will suffer a decrease in chroma. As a reminder, the colors with maximum distance are complementary and give a neutral gray mixture. This also means that the gamut formed by the starting colors on your palette can't be exceeded. If you choose low chroma colors, all your mixtures will have a low chroma. To obtain a color outside of the gamut, it will therefore be necessary to add an additional pigment. Let's take an example. Let's imagine that we have to mix the following color. We will start from this model and try to get as close as possible with successive comparisons. The first thing to do is to evaluate where the target color would be in the color wheel. The diagrams that come with this course can be used as a guide for this. They can help you find out which pigment is the closest to the model. It can sometimes be hard to see the difference between pigments out of the tube, so to have a better idea of their specific properties, mix them all with different quantities of white. This will reveal their undertone and indicate how they behave in mixtures. Once you have a pigment to start with, evaluate the difference between this pigment and the target color. The secret of color mixing, if we can say that it's a secret, is the following. You can never find the right color. You have to start with a base and compare methodically to get closer to the model. Colors cannot be found. You have to try, compare, and adjust. It's impossible to start with nothing, so you have to make what I call a mixing base to start. Then you have to take the time to compare it to the model and ask yourself what needs to be changed so that the mix gets closer to the model. You should ask yourself 3 questions in a specific order. What's the difference in hue? What's the difference in value? And what's the difference in chroma? First, adjust the hue. To do this, imagine your color in the space of the color wheel, surrounded by the main colors that you use as a reference. The best reference points are those that are evenly distributed in the color space, so I suggest using red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, and magenta. Imagine that you need to pull your mix towards one of the main colors. Should it be more yellow, more red, more magenta, more blue, more cyan, or more green? Adjust the hue using the appropriate pigment, a pigment that's in the right direction in the color wheel. Then adjust the value. For this, you need a pigment to lighten and a pigment to darken. White and black can be used, of course, but it will be very difficult to maintain the integrity of the mixture, as both white and black tend to make the mixtures cooler. Black can ideally be replaced by a mix of a dark brown and blue, but it's also possible to use a lighter or darker pigment that's neither white nor black. For example, you can use yellow to lighten or blue to darken. It all depends on the character of the color and the nature of the mix. White is a fundamental element of most blends, and it's impossible to do without in most situations. On the other hand, black can be replaced to make colors darker. And as we've already seen, black can be created with a wide variety of dark colors. Finally, check that the chroma is correct. Depending on the pigments, their tinting strength, and their relative position in the color wheel, chroma can vary greatly. The first thing to say is that the use of a pigment with a high tinting strength can have a very overwhelming effect in terms of chroma. Some colors dominate more than others, so make sure that you mix the various pigments in the right proportions. The second thing is that the effect of complementary colors must be taken into account. Pigments diametrically opposed in the color wheel are complementary colors. It's possible to neutralize a color that's too strong with a small amount of an opposite pigment. It's not necessary to have a color that's exactly complementary for the chroma drop to be effective. Apart from this effect of complementary color, if you want to make a color less chromatic, another simple and effective method is to add a color with a low chroma simply. In general, the best way to understand mixtures is experience. Paints are not ideal colors, they have a substantial unpredictability. It's impossible to accurately predict the result of a mixture. Only experience with the pigments will give you an idea. This is why many artists use a standard palette whose pigments they know very well. The advantage of defining your own standard palette is that you will know the pigments really well. It's impossible to define a mixing method that can be a better guide than spontaneity and experience. And the more time you'll spend with your pigments, the better you'll know all their subtleties. The string method. To make color mixing easier, remember the idea of tiny strings. Imagine that each pigment is connected to your mixture by a small string. By adding ultramarine blue, your mixture will tend towards this blue and therefore become darker. By using cadmium red, it will be drawn towards red and made slightly lighter. You can add a string with yellow ochre, which will pull this mixture towards the center, making it more gray. You can pull more or less on each string depending on the proportions of paint that you use, and if you pull too hard on one, you can compensate by pulling on the others again. The mixing wheel is not intended to be a good predictor of the result of a paint mixture, but it can at least give you a good idea. With the idea of the imaginary strings, you need to find out in which direction the mixtures should be pulled to give it the desired hue, value, or chroma. Start with the weakest pigments as a mixing base. Always use the pigment with the lowest tinting strength first. This will allow you to get the right amount of paint in the first place. You will, in a way, use this color as a starting paste to which the other pigments will be added in smaller quantities. If possible, add them in order from lowest to highest tinting strength. Most often, white, inorganic, opaque pigments and earth will serve as the starting paste, while transparent organic pigments will modify the hue greatly, even in small quantities. For example, if I have to mix yellow ochre, quinacridone rose, and phthalo green to obtain a sort of warm gray, I first take the desired amount of paint by creating a base out of yellow ochre, then I add a relatively small amount of quinacridone rose, which is much more powerful. And finally, I use a very small touch of phthalo green to neutralize the color and pull it more towards gray. No matter how many pigments you have on your palette, if possible, try to find 3 starting pigments to get the desired mix, and then only add more if necessary. Imagine that you connect 3 pigments to form a triangle embracing the target color. This triangle represents the gamut of this given mix. 3 well-chosen pigments are generally sufficient to mix any color, and some artists use only 3 pigments for all their paintings. Start with 3 and try to get as close as possible. If you need to adjust with an additional pigment, keep this option until the end, once you have reached a sufficient level of similarity. Very often, this will not be necessary. Here's an exercise to familiarize yourself with the mixing system. It will help you learn how to navigate the mixing wheel. It's a difficult exercise, so I hope you're ready. Take 2 pigments at random, any pigments. Okay, I'll do the demonstration with burnt sienna and cobalt teal blue. But after that, it will be up to you to take 2 pigments at random and do the same exercise on your palette. Step 1 is to try to predict what color will result from this mix. Here, if I have my colors in mind and if I visualize them in the wheel in equal proportions, I predict that they should produce a very dull green, quite close to a gray. Let's see if my guess is right. Well, that's close enough, but it's not exactly what I had in mind. I didn't expect it to be so greenish. This is where the second phase begins, and the real challenge too. You have to turn this color into a neutral gray, with only the 2 original pigments, burnt sienna and cobalt teal blue, plus a third pigment that still needs to be found. So the entire exercise now consists in finding a third pigment that can work as a complement to this green mix. Remember, a complement is always on the opposite side of the wheel, so we are looking for a pigment that is somewhat opposed to this green mix. It doesn't have to be perfectly placed. Take the best pigment that you have. It must at least be on the other side of the wheel, so that the central gray point is included in the triangle created by the 3 pigments. In our example, let's make a triangle with, so of course, burnt sienna, cobalt teal blue, and let's take permanent rose, or like quinacridone rose, because it's a color that's ideally located in relation to this green. Let's start mixing. At this stage, I actually find myself with 3 mixing primaries, and the goal is to find the neutral point of this gamut. Somewhere in this triangle, there is a very precise center point where all 3 pigments neutralize each other. This neutral point can be very hard to find because some pigments dominate a lot, and it may also be that if you didn't pick the right pigment, it's possible that the gamut doesn't even cover the gray center. It could be the case if the 3 colors that you have are on the same side of the wheel, but if you have aimed correctly using the mixing wheel, your 3 pigments should work. I proceed by trial and error. As soon as one color dominates, I add a little bit of the other 2 to pull it in the opposite direction. I always imagine my little strings pulling on each side. I pull slightly on one side, then on the other 2, and so on until I reach a mixture that does not have the chromatic elements of any of the starting primaries. At this point, I add a little bit of titanium white to make it easier to find a neutral gray. Only white is allowed for this exercise, no other pigment. You can compare using your value scale if necessary. If the gray pulls too much on one side, you can still adjust by using one of the 3 starting colors. Do this until you get a gray that's as close as possible to the perfectly neutral gray. No need to try to get a perfect gray, the goal is simply to be as close as possible. It's mostly an exercise. Do this 10 times using different combinations and your pigments will no longer have any secrets for you. Now that you have all the knowledge you need to get as close as possible to your target color, it's important to say that in most cases, you won't need a very high degree of accuracy for color mixing. Indeed, in a painting, color mixing is not an exact science, and the painter's work is above all about spontaneity. Does this mean that all the previous techniques in the theory are useless? Of course not. Any knowledge or technique allowing the painter to approach the ideal color is of great help. That being said, one must take into account the practical reality of a painting. The painter doesn't work like a printer, which calculates precisely the proportion of each primary to get exactly the right mixture. The colors in a painting are mixed organically, blending with each other and following the artist's fancy most of the time. Moreover, we can say that it would be counterproductive to mix tediously every nuance on the palette to then realize that the result is very different once it's applied on the canvas. Mixing techniques must therefore be adapted to the spontaneous and organic nature of the painting process. To do this, it's important to understand that there are actually two types of color mixing: palette mixing and canvas mixing. Palette mixing consists of everything we've seen in the previous chapters. It includes all the steps necessary to create a mixture before the brush touches the canvas. Most of the time, this type of mixing is done with a palette knife, but it can be done with a brush directly on the palette. And in this type of mixing, the colors are very easy to distinguish from each other. Canvas mixing, or surface mixing, consists of all the chromatic effects that occur after the brush has touched the canvas. There are two types of those: wet on wet and wet on dry. Wet on wet mixing happens when a brushstroke blends naturally with the wet paint. In this case, the brush itself creates a new color mixture where the brushstroke is applied. The rule to know here is that the more the brush rubs the area, the more pronounced the mixture on the canvas will be. If this effect is not under control, it can be very upsetting for beginners who usually tend to rub the canvas with the brush repeatedly. However, if this effect is understood and controlled, it can produce a very wide variety of nuances. The angle, the number of strokes, and the force of the pressure are decisive. Canvas mixing can be a good or a bad thing, depending on your objective. If you want to avoid the effect of canvas mixing, here's what to do. Pick up a generous amount of paint with the brush. Avoid pressing the brush more than 3 to 5 times. Press with a light and dynamic gesture. And finally, go back to the palette regularly to take more wet paint. This way you will preserve the actual colors that you have on your palette. Canvas mixing can also happen wet on dry. Glazing, scumbling, velatura, and all the techniques that require painting in a transparent or semi-transparent manner on a dry layer produce various optical mixing effects. It's very complicated to actually predict the result of these optical effects, as they depend on many factors. Experience is key here, and over time, most artists naturally learn to predict the effects of canvas mixing wet on dry, and if you learn to understand it, you can use it to your advantage. Rather than trying to predict the mix on the canvas, here's a strategy you can follow to better control the effects. I call it the small sample strategy, 3 S's. It's very simple. Once you have your mix on your palette, if you have any doubt about the result of the canvas mixing, just put a small sample on a discrete area. Preferably, choose an area that's not very visible or easy to correct, as the test may not be conclusive. A very small sample is enough to get a good idea of the result. For example, on this portrait, which is touch dry, let's imagine that I want to create slightly bluer reflected lights. I start by creating a mix on my palette, trying to get close to the target color that I want to paint. Now I'm gonna make a small test near the hand, as this location is relatively less visible. If I'm not satisfied, I can always remove what I've just done with a piece of paper towel or a rag. A few slight bluish traces can sometimes remain visible, but it's easy to correct with a very small touch of paint and counter this effect, because the quantity is very, very small. If you ever paint wet on wet, you can scrape the incorrect part with a palette knife or simply brush over it. If you do that with small, subtle strokes, it is difficult to ruin your work. If I want to try my color on the face now, I will avoid placing my sample right in the middle, and a very small touch is enough on the side. As you can see here, this blue cyan is way too light for this area, but this effect of canvas mixing would have been very hard to predict. No problem, I can just go back to my palette, add more paint to darken the mixture. Now with this second try, I can see that the color is more in line with what I was looking for, so thanks to this strategy, I'm confident that I'm on the right track. I can now finish painting this area, and I can now cover it with a light, semi-transparent veil. This strategy, which is very simple but very useful, helps unifying palette mixing and canvas mixing and understand all the different dimensions of color effects. It's a bridge between the theory of color mixing and the unpredictability of actual painting on the canvas. Most confirmed artists, without knowing it or calling it a specific technique, practice this actually spontaneously and naturally. A closed palette or a pre-mixed palette is a method of preparing some color steps before painting. In a closed palette, the artist mixes a scale of values comprising between 3 and 9 colors from light to dark. Of course, not all the colors of the painting have to be pre-mixed, only the most important ones. For example, the flesh tones, the clothing, the foliage, etc. To create a value scale, it's first necessary to find the local color of the subject that needs to be painted. The local value corresponds to the color not affected by highlights or shadows. Once the local value is mixed, the method consists in darkening or lightening it to obtain between 3 and 9 values. To darken and lighten, find pigments that match the shadows and the lights of the subject. It's a very effective method to master values. It's a fundamental concept for successful realism. The value scale is not used mechanically. It serves as a basis and is adjusted with other pigments as necessary. Two different scales can be used to complement each other. A first option is to create a warm and a cool scale. The second option is to use two complementary scales so that a mixture of the two can produce a neutral gray. The third option is to use a normal scale and a gray scale. Here are some things to avoid if you want to work with a closed palette. Do not always prepare the same default palette, but take each subject as a reference point by observing the subtleties of its shades. Don't limit yourself to black and white to darken and lighten. Follow the nuances of your subject. Don't use your pre-mixed palette without any additional pigments to modify the hue or the chroma. Save your pre-mixed palette only for the main subjects. You don't need to use it for all colors. Glazing is a technique that consists in superimposing a layer of transparent paint on top of a dry layer of paint. Glazing can create effects that would not be possible by direct mixing. In particular, glazing can produce very deep, vivid or complex colors by successive superposition. glazes can create a very unique visual impression. They seem to appear closer than regular paint. Therefore, it is recommended to avoid them for objects in the distance and background. On the other hand, they are very useful to highlight a prominent subject. A glaze has a depth that makes the colors feel more intense than direct blends. Let's take an opaque pigment like yellow ochre and a transparent pigment like quinacridone rose. If these two paints are mixed directly to form a single paste, the color of the rose dominates, but the opacity of the yellow ochre cancels out the transparency of the paste. If, on the other hand, the yellow is allowed to dry and the rose is glazed on top, a very different optical mixture is obtained. In a glaze, light goes through both layers, resulting in a subtractive blend, much like when you place a colored filter over an image. Let's take the example of these colored filters. As you can see, they let light through, but they filter certain wavelength. A glaze works exactly like that. Thus, a white object glazed with red appears red, but a blue or green object appears black, or at least very dark. Indeed, the light reflected by a green or blue object contains no red wavelength. As a result, if blue and green wavelengths are absorbed by the filter, no light can go through and creates black. Here's the theory to know about filters. Red filters blue and green and only allows red to pass through. Green filters red and blue and only allows green to pass through. Blue filters red and green and only lets blue through. Cyan filters red and lets green and blue pass through. Magenta filters green and allows blue and red to pass through. Finally, yellow filters blue and allows red and green to pass through. Finally, note that any filter reduces the amount of light and therefore reduces the value. The more filters you stack on top of each other, the less wavelength can pass through and the closer you get to black. And this is the same with glazes. All of this is in theory, of course. It's important to understand how filters work, but the result of a glaze is more subtle and more complex. No pigment can be perfectly transparent. A small part of the light will be diffused by the upper layer, and therefore yellow glazed over blue has a different appearance than blue glazed over yellow. With this example with Prussian blue and yellow lake, you can see that the order of the layers is not interchangeable. Predicting the result of a glaze is not easy. There are so many differences between pigments that it is impossible to predict with certainty the final result of a glaze. The best technique is to do small tests on small scraps of canvas or on areas of the painting that can be easily corrected. Another trick is to use a piece of glass. First, apply the glaze on the piece of glass and place it over the part of the painting you want to glaze. This should reveal the effect of the glaze. In this example, I'm using phthalo turquoise to glaze this red dress, and the idea is to get rid of this red because red and cyan are complementary. So the cyan glaze will act like a filter and remove all red wavelength, which means that the result will be almost black. At least it will be very dark, but also very intense and deep because of the high tinting strength of the phthalo pigment. A glaze can be removed. Here's how to do it. Apply it on a discrete area that you're not afraid to mess up and observe the result. If the color is not what you're looking for, use a clean, lint-free cloth to absorb the paint. Traces can remain visible, but they will be covered once you have found a glaze that suits you. Otherwise, retouch with normal opaque paint to remove the damage. Keep in mind that all glazes absorb light like filters, so the more layers you lay on top of each other, the less light can go through, and the darker the whole thing looks. All transparent pigments work for glazes. Here's a short list to give you an idea. ultramarine blue, Prussian blue, phthalo blue, burnt carmine, quinacridone rose, alizarin crimson, naphthol red, transparent burnt umber, transparent brown ochre, transparent burnt sienna, transparent red oxide, yellow lake, sap green, phthalo green, etc. The same technique can be used by replacing transparent pigments with semi-opaque or semi-transparent pigments. In this case, we speak of velatura. This technique is applied exactly like a glaze, but gives a less intense result. Due to the fact that it's not perfectly transparent, it's similar to what could be achieved by direct mixing. It's a technique that can be interesting to modify shadows on a portrait or create very smooth transitions between shadows and light, in the same way as in the sfumato introduced by Leonardo da Vinci. So far we've seen how to find, mix and use specific colors, but this next part will be about choosing a set of colors that go well together. Let's be clear, I don't pretend to know better than anyone else which colors are the most harmonious. I believe that a good painter can make a wonderful painting with colors that have nothing to do with each other. Unlike music, where chords and chord progressions follow well-established harmonic principles, painters have the power to reveal beauty even in dissonance. I'll try to present ideas and methods that can help you in your paintings, but take them only as suggestions. We can see what follows as a set of composition rules, but keep in mind that it is often the exceptions to the rules that make the best paintings. You have to know the well-established path, but you should never hesitate to explore unknown territories. Color is not only hue. Too often when we think about color composition, we think of hues. Should we put yellow with purple, green with pink, etc.? But this approach neglects two aspects of color, value and chroma. Without taking into account the values, how can we understand, let's say, the composition of a chiaroscuro, like this Madeleine Pénitente by Georges de la Tour? Over millions of years, our vision has evolved to give priority to the perception of values and contrasts. This is what makes it possible to see the crevices of the ground, avoid a hole, or spot a shadow hiding the sun. But it's not always easy to isolate value from the other dimensions of color. Here are some tips that will help you reduce your perception of hue and chroma and therefore better visualize the values. Tip number 1 is to squint your eyes. Tip number 2 is to look at your subject in a black mirror, or you can also use a phone that's turned off because it has a black screen and it also works. You can take a picture and set the saturation to 0. For a composition with values, the easiest thing to do is to do a value study or a preparatory charcoal drawing. A monochromatic or a black and white study reveals the distribution of dark and light colors on the painting without adding chroma and hue. This step is important because it shows how shapes and volumes affect the appearance of the composition. It's a little bit like creating a black and white model. If the subject already works well in black and white, and if you already get the desired effect, then it's a sign that the colors will just complete and sublimate an already solid composition. At this stage, you can decide whether you prefer to paint a light background or a dark background, whether you prefer to give the impression of a dim, a soft light, or a bright, sharp light, it would be a mistake to neglect value in the composition because it is the first element we perceive. In a way, value is like the skeleton of the entire painting. Chroma is the second notion to take into account when thinking about color composition, and it is certainly the most important. Indeed, if all colors have a high chroma, the overall impression can quickly become shrill and unpleasant. On the other hand, if most colors are rather dull, but only one touch of a strong, vivid color appears, the eye will naturally be attracted to it. There's always been this idea in my mind that chroma is a little bit like sugar for the eye. As with sugar, it's important not to overuse it. In painting, chroma essentially has an exciting role. Bright, intense colors excite the eye, whereas dull colors reduce this impression. Chroma can be used to focus attention, it can be used to guide the eye, it can be unifying, or on the contrary, it can create a clash. As you might expect, it's all about balance. Imagine a balance. On one side, a very dull color is placed. On the other, a very chromatic color. The latter will make the scale weigh on its side. To regain balance, the duller color has to be larger and take more space. Now, what can we make of it? Using these principles and inspired by music theory, I have identified three main concepts to remember. The tonic. It's the main color of the painting, the one that first comes to mind when remembering the painting. The dominant. I call a color dominant if it's the color that occupies the largest surface area, but it is generally duller than the tonic. The accent. It's a small touch of color with a very small surface area, supposed to attract the eye. Now, with this in mind, here are some typical models that you can use to compose with chroma. Neutral composition. This is the simplest model and it is particularly effective. The majority of the surface of the painting is composed of colors with weak chroma. None of them seem to prevail over the others. Therefore, it creates a peaceful, stable, and unified atmosphere. This model leaves the eye completely free to focus mainly on the drawing and on the shapes. The colors fade away to give way to other modes of expression. This model lets the observer's eye move pretty freely in the space of the painting. Dominant accent. The dominant color is defined by the space it occupies. It is generally low or neutral in chroma, and it is visible on the larger surface of the canvas, whereas the accent is a high chroma color that occupies a very small surface. The dominant color is often the background color. The dominant creates unity, while the accent attracts the eye. This model is perfect for creating a harmonious and unified atmosphere, where only a small touch of a bright color takes the attention. The observer's eye will tend to look at the whole painting in a circular way, then focus on the accent, and finally return to the whole. Dominant, subdominant. There can be more than one dominant. If another color plays the same role, I call it the subdominant. The subdominant color is a rather low chroma color that complements the dominant. Both generally look pretty similar. One thing is for sure, the subdominant and dominant do not compete. They complement each other without any conflict. No one prevails. There can be as many subdominants as there are colors that meet these criteria. In this model, the eye is not particularly attracted by one color or another. It is free to navigate wherever it pleases. Dominant tonic. The tonic color is the main color. It is the one that sets the tone of the painting. It prevails. It's not just an accent, because it can be relatively large. However, it's not the space it occupies that defines it, but its central role in the painting. To put it simply, the tonic is the color that you keep in mind when you recollect memories of the painting. For example, I went to see this exhibition last week and I really like this painting of the young boy in red. See, the tonic is the red. The tonic is most often a medium or high chroma color, but it doesn't have to be necessarily very strong to stand out. The dominant completes the tonic by offering it a neutral context on which it can be fully revealed. The observer's eye will tend to immediately focus on the tonic color, which is the main subject of the painting. Then it will examine the color in its context and it will go to the dominant next. Tonic, subtonic. A painting can have several tonic colors. When it is impossible to remember one color without the others, it means that there are several colors that contribute to setting the tone of the painting. This pattern occurs when several bright chromatic colors complement each other. The tonic is the color of the main subject, while the subtone or the subtones are the other high chroma colors that provide variety. This scheme is well suited for all kinds of subjects. It allows the eye to focus on the main subject while offering a counterweight with the subtonic. It's a very good model for narration because the eye can focus on multiple subjects. Tonic/dominant. A particular pattern occurs when the tonic color is also the dominant one, the one that occupies the most space. This is often the case in landscapes with a big blue sky or when the background has a high chroma. The effect is generally very pronounced, so much so that the painting is identified as much by its color as by its subject. This Salomé by Henri Regnault is painted with a warm yellow-orange, which is both the dominant and the tonic. This gold-yellow hue is not just decorative here, it's an integral part of the narration. When the tonic is also dominant, the eye is not drawn to a particular point, but the whole gives an impression of great chromatic intensity. The tonic/dominant brings both energy and unity, which creates a very dynamic atmosphere. You can have more complex compositions, such as in Lorenzo Lotto's Venus and Cupid, where the tonic and the subtonic are also dominant and subdominant. Both colors complete the sumptuous golden white tones of the goddess's skin. Of course, it can become complicated to juggle with these concepts. Tonic, dominant, accent. These ideas must be seen with a little bit of distance. It's not a matter of measuring the surface occupied by a color to know if it's a dominant. That's not the point. It's not a science or an established rule. It's more a way of seeing and thinking about the role each color plays. The central idea is that very different roles can be played by the same color by playing on the space and the chroma. Profusion. When there is a profusion of multiple vivid colors with high chroma that complement or are in conflict with each other, it creates a very multicolored universe. The eye is drawn into the chaos of the mixtures without really being able to say which one prevails. This model is well suited to subject with a strong sense of joy and energy. To avoid creating a shrill and unpleasant universe, uses slightly low chroma dominant and subdominant to unify the multiple vivid colors and give them a context in which to express themselves. There are still many ways to explore based on the notions of dominant, tonic, and accent. You can rearrange them however you like, and you can find more original composition models. I'm sure you'll be able to use all the resources of your colors. Keep in mind that for figurative paintings, it's often better to avoid saturating the color composition too much. Neutral colors, cool or warm gray, brown, all these colors allow to highlight the subject much better. Take advantage of the almost infinite variety of low chroma nuances, and keep the most intense colors for a few well-chosen areas. That being said, nothing is stopping you from breaking the rules and creating imbalances. The only limit is your imagination. The harmony of hues is what most theories cover when they talk about composition. But does it have a theoretical basis? Is there any reason to justify some hue combinations rather than others, or are these just arbitrary decisions? There is one thing that has a real and objective grounding in our vision: visual complementary colors. Remember when we talked about retinal persistence? We saw that the complementary couples are not random or chosen, but they are part of the mechanisms of our vision. Red is complementary to cyan, blue is complementary to yellow, and green is complementary to magenta. That's mechanical. This is, I believe, the most solid basis if we want to try to establish a harmony of hues. It will therefore be necessary to organize the color wheel so that the complementary hues are diametrically opposed. We can use the CMYRGB model with 6 hues, or the 12 hues adjusted wheel that I propose to you, which is a little bit more suitable for transposition with real pigments. The red, yellow, blue wheel has to be excluded because it has incorrect complementary pairs. Red is not complementary to green, so it doesn't work. Here are the main hue combinations that you can use. Monochrome. A monochrome subject is an ideal way to create a unified atmosphere in which the hue itself is symbolic. Since we're dealing with this subject, let's briefly discuss the symbolism of the different hues in Western culture. Please note that we are talking about Western culture here, and that these hues may have other meanings in other cultures. On a personal level, I reject any form of hue symbolism because they are all very stereotypical and far from the true symbolism that a work of art can achieve. I don't think that an artist should have to conform to this type of symbolism at all. However, people who will look at your paintings may know these significations, may know these meanings, and they may have it in mind, so you might as well know them if you want to avoid unpleasant surprises. Red is associated with danger, war, anger, fire, blood, strength, but also in a more positive way, passion, desire, love, strength, energy, and excitement. Orange is associated with energy, enthusiasm, and warmth. Yellow means joy, happiness, optimism, idealism, imagination, gold, deceit, jealousy, and cowardice. Green means nature, life, care, fertility, and poison. Turquoise or cyan is associated with calm, water, or spirituality. Blue is associated with cold, stability, harmony, peace, trust, and inspiration. Magenta or pink is often associated with femininity, softness, innocence, love, or tenderness. Black is often associated with negativity, evil, death, night, and mourning. And finally, white is often associated with perfection, purity, innocence, sweetness, lightness, cleanliness, and virginity. Well, do what you want with this list. For me, they are insignificant for artistic work because a good artist must always be able to paint death with white and joy with black. On the other hand, knowing these codes will somehow allow you to play with them, to surprise your viewers and to avoid being surprised by their reactions. Complementary. Complementary hues are diametrically opposed in the color wheel. They are the most distant in terms of color. What one lacks is present in the other. Complementary colors form an extremely dynamic opposition. Each complementary reinforces the visual impact of its opposite. They repel and attract each other at the same time. Another great benefit of complementary pigments is that mixing them gives a neutral gray. There are several interesting variants associated with the complementary model. Split complementary. This combination starts with a pair of complements, but one is divided into two of its analogues, i.e. neighboring colors. It's a very interesting model which brings more variety than the simple complementary model. The two analogous colors work together harmoniously, while the opposite color brings energy. The single hue will most likely be the tonic. This combination brings both harmony and energy and always works really well. Analogous. Analogous colors are similar colors, which are next to each other in the color wheel. They almost blend into each other and soothe each other, so that none of them seem to really take over. This combination creates a unified and peaceful atmosphere. Be careful because if this harmony can be pleasing to the eye, it can also feel a bit monotonous. The use of an accent can be a wise choice to make an analogous composition more exciting. The variants in this model are mainly due to the number of hues involved. Two analogous form a very tight pair. The whole composition looks almost monochromatic. They are very close and work in a very similar way, so much so that one can be used to replace the other. Three analogous make a wider range while keeping a strong sense of unity. They mix into hues that naturally match and harmonize. Four analogous brings a little bit more variety. Separate analogous is the same model, but the middle hue color is removed in order to avoid too much monotony. The warm-cool distinction is drawn by dividing the circle into two hemispheres. The first, from magenta to yellow, corresponds to the warm colors. The second, from blue to green, corresponds to the cool colors. Free combination. Two hues with no specific relationship can always be combined regardless of the colors. Their connection will mostly be determined by their relative position on the color wheel. If they are both in the warm color hemicycle, they will work more like analogous colors. It's the same if they're both on the cool side. But if one is on the warm side and the other on the cool side, they will work more like complementary colors. If you want to freely associate more than two hues, make sure to bring variety in chroma and value. A hue will generally be allowed to prevail as the tonic, and the remaining hues will be used with low chroma as the dominant and subdominant so as not to create any conflict. Triadic. The triadic model brings together three hues, which are approximately part of three different thirds of the wheel. This means that there is no specific similarity or connection between each hue. This combination is not harmonious in itself. It's the job of the painter to make it work. With a triadic composition, all the dimensions of color need to be carefully balanced. It's generally better to bring a lot of variety in value and chroma to avoid to create a conflict. Let one dominate and use the other two to create a neutral context. Quaternary. This model is like the triadic with 4 hues. As in the latter, a well-balanced composition will allow you to bring focus on the most important part and avoid dissonance. Value and chroma create a hierarchy and impose an order into what can quickly become chaotic. As you can see on this painting by Veronese, the blue cyan of Jesus' robe is clearly the focus point. But this is only made possible by the fact that the pink, green and orange hues are all weaker in chroma. Classical. The classical model uses the 4 basic psychological hues: red, yellow, green and blue. This harmony is useful when many elements must all stand out, like in the religious paintings of the Renaissance, where all characters had to be recognizable. As an example, you can take the palette of Raphael and other artists of the classical Renaissance, whose aim was to make Bible stories as understandable as possible. This is why they used multiple vivid colors of similar chroma so that each character would appear clearly and distinctly. Artist's primary model. This model is not particularly original, but it is widespread due to the predominance of the red, yellow and blue primaries in artistic education. It's also a combination of color that reminds us of the draperies of religious paintings of the classical Renaissance, the period when these primaries were introduced. Basic landscape model. The classical landscape model brings together yellow, blue and green. It's a very effective color harmony that creates a very natural, organic atmosphere. Let's now look at practical applications to all these concepts. How can you concretely benefit from this knowledge in your paintings? First of all, it's important to remember that if your only goal is realism, your choice of colors will mostly be dictated by the model. The composition is provided by the colors that must be represented accurately. That said, even if realism is your priority, color composition is still a question that you must ask yourself. Which objects will you choose? In your still life, for instance, what color do you want for the dress of your model if you paint a portrait? Which part of the landscape will you choose to paint? On the other hand, if you prefer expressiveness to realism, there is a lot more choice and colors can be manipulated at will. In both cases, it's always a good idea to be able to make a simplified color map. This can be made in order to analyze the colors of the painting or to prepare for a future project. Here's the analysis method that I propose. Let's map the composition using a notation system that allows each color to be placed according to its role. I call this the chromatic map. Let's use 3 shapes, a rectangle, a square, and a thin stripe, almost like a line. The rectangle will correspond to the dominant color, the color that occupies the largest surface. The square is the tonic, i.e. the key color of the painting, and finally the very thin line corresponds to the accent. Each part can be broken down into subparts. The dominant can be composed of various subdominants, the tonic can also be composed of various subtones, and we can split each space into as many subdivisions as necessary. Let's take this seascape by Winslow Homer, for example. The dominant is composed of a dark brown-gray and various sand tones, while the tonic is this turquoise blue in the waves. The accent, very discreet, is a slightly more intense orange-brown, a very small dot on the horizon. Barely visible, but calling for contemplation, which perhaps symbolizes a call to the unknown throughout torment. Another example, let's analyze the colors of this Venus and Cupid by Lorenzo Lotto. you can see that the dominant also acts as the tonic. The red of the drapery is the key of this composition, and it is also the dominant color because it's used as a background. This color is in an opposition-attraction relationship with the subtonic, the blue drape under the goddess. Finally, a third subtone completes this triangle, this light yellow, ochre and gold, which finds its accomplishment in the sumptuous whiteness of the skin. This painting is built around three hues that correspond to the traditional primaries: red, yellow and blue. It's also a split complementary harmony. In this painting by Degas, the harmony is based on the free association of an orange-yellow and an emerald cyan green. The dominant is made of yellows and light brown. It allows the greenish dance's outfits to stand out in a vibrant and harmonious way. Finally, the accent is made up of light rose that can be seen on the dance's skin. This self-portrait of Wengrow consists of little dots that gives this painting vibrant and complex colors. The exact color is difficult to describe because it is pointillism, but it can be simplified by saying that the dominant is a deep green cyan supplemented by an even darker blue cyan subdominant. The tonic is the red-orange color of the painter's skin and beard. Finally, the subtone is the darker red that gives the jacket and the lips their appearance in small touches. Once again, this painting is constructed on a split complementary harmony. Let's now take this painting by Hoppers, Nighthawks. In this painting, with well-defined colors but complex architecture, the dominant color is made up of shades ranging from blue cyan to green cyan, dark and chromatic. These shades provide the unique character of this almost otherworldly night. The tonic color, as is often the case in subjects with artificial light, is the yellow of the lamps, which is also declined in the dark ochre and brown on the bar counter. The accent is created by the red of the woman's dress. Let's conclude with one last example of great originality, Gustav Klimt's portrait of Mera Primavesi. This painting has a very unusual purple, tonic and dominant that resonates with the assertive personality of the 9-year-old girl. This uncommon purple is found even on the features of her face. It is complemented by green and blue dots that appear to be crushed by the white beige of the girl's dress. Finally, several orange-red accents bring lively colors into this universe, overflowing with originality. Very few paintings use these colors and break the rules to such an extent. Now that we've seen all these examples, let's see how you can apply this method to prepare your own painting. Start with your chromatic map. On a sheet of paper or on a piece of canvas, draw a rectangle, a square and a line. Delimit them with masking tape if necessary. On your palette, mix the colors inspired by your subject. If you've already done some preparatory work, such as a drawing or a value study, the work will only be easier. Place your colors next to each other and observe how they combine. Do many tests directly on the palette. You can even paint a miniature of your painting directly on the palette. This could give you an early idea of the result. Once your colors are chosen, place them in the rectangle, the square, and the small strip. You can decline these colors in as many shades as needed. Now that you have all the keys in hand, all you need is inspiration. And I'm sure that your imagination will find inspiration in all the wonders of nature and the greatest masterpiece of the art world. The feathers of a bird, the reflections of the moonlight, the eyes of a child, the brushstrokes of a great master. There is no shortage of inspiration, and I'm sure they will provide you endless energy and creativity. All this composition theory is fine, but it doesn't take into account the fact that artists need models to paint. Even if you paint entirely from your imagination, What you're really doing is digging into your memory to find visual recollection of models you have previously seen. Figurative painting without a model is impossible. Therefore, the question is, now that you have all this, the color map of your choice, how do you make it work with your model? There is a huge problem here. The colors you want to paint are not necessarily those on your model. So how do you make them work together? There are two methods that can give you very different results in the end. A method that plays on the accessories and a method that deeply modifies the atmosphere of the painting. 1. Modify the colors of the accessories. The easiest method to change colors is to play on accessories. Change the color of non-essential objects such as clothes, vases, curtains, furniture, flowers, etc. Change the color of the imprimatura and the background. All the essential things have a color that remains the same, like the face, the hair, the hands. But for the rest, you can play on the accessories and change what's not essential. You don't need to invent the new colors, you can find them on other models. Imagine that you had a model with a red dress, but at the last moment you want to change your chromatic composition. You can maybe put a blue dress on a mannequin to get a model of the new color. With this method, the most difficult thing to do is to keep the unity of the entire painting. It often happens that modified colors appear to be somewhat foreign to the composition, because the character of the scene and the context have not been properly taken into account by the artist. So be sure to integrate the new colors into their context. To do that, you need to pay attention to the values, to make sure that the shadows that affect the other objects also affect the accessories you want to add. You also need to pay attention to the temperature of the light source. For example, if your subject is lit by a candle, all the colors of the new accessories must be predominantly warm. This can be done by first mixing the colors normally and then adding a warm pigment to replicate the impression of the warm light source. This method of using accessories is the most neutral. The objects keep a natural look, and you will be the only one who knows that the colors were fake and they were only there to match your chromatic map. Modify the color in depth. The second method consists in modifying all the colors starting from the primaries, so as to give the impression that it is the light of the whole scene that has changed, and not only the colors of the objects. It's important to use the concept of gamut here. Start by analyzing the main colors that make up your model. Collect all the paint tubes you would use to paint the normal colors. Now take the chromatic map you've created and replace the pigments in your usual palette with pigments that you want in your composition. From now on, set aside the old colors and they should no longer be used. Once your mixtures are ready, it will be useful to carry out a small study to make sure that you can paint in this range and also to familiarize yourself with the strangeness of these new colors. Then start your painting by visualizing each time which mixture plays the role of which color. Do not let yourself be destabilized. Keep in mind that you are recreating an entire scene where the light is completely changed. Focus on values and imagine if necessary that your painting is in black and white. If it helps, you can take pictures of your composition regularly and put them in black and white to check if you are still close to your model. An image editing software can help you, so don't hesitate to use it if needed. This method is very complex and will require a lot of practice. On the other hand, it creates a breathtaking atmospheric effect because it gives the illusion that the light itself has changed.